The prairie wind cut across the open range, kicking up dust that shimmered under the moonlight like silver sparks from an old campfire. Out of that lonesome dark came a young woman, her fancy dress torn to rags, boots heavy with miles, carrying the look of someone running from ghosts. She was Evelyn Marlowe, once the jewel of high society, but out here her name didn't buy her water, safety, or a place to lay her head. Every step she took away from her past felt like dragging a wagon load of secrets through mud, deeper than the Red River after spring rain. On the far ridge, lantern light burned from a ranch house porch, a steady beacon against the wide and wild emptiness of the frontier night. Alejandro Reyes stood there, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of sun and saddle, his eyes steady as a fence post driven deep in dry ground. He saw her stumble, shaking like a calf lost in a storm, and he knew right off she wasn't just tired. She was carrying hurt, heavier than any pack mule. Evelyn lifted her chin, though her legs wobbled, and met the gaze of the rancher, her heart pounding like hooves on hardpan. The hush between them felt older than words, a silence that carried the promise of both danger and salvation under the same Texas sky. And with a voice low and sure as rolling thunder, Alejandro tipped his hat and said, "You're safe here now." The morning sun spilled over the horizon like molten gold, stretching shadows of cattle across the pasture in long, restless streaks. Evelyn sat on the porch rail, her hands still trembling, watching the world wake up with the unease of someone who hadn't felt safe in years. Alejandro stepped out with a tin cup of coffee, steam curling into the cool air, smelling of earth, smoke, and the steady comfort of routine. He set the cup beside her without a word, the kind of gesture that spoke louder than any sermon or city promise ever could. She lifted it slow, the heat biting her palms, and for a moment it felt like she was holding on to life itself instead of slipping through its cracks. Across the corral, horses shifted and stamped, tails swishing, as if they too sensed the change that had walked into their world overnight. Alejandro leaned against the post, hat pulled low, watching her with the patience of a man who had learned that silence was a stronger medicine than pity. Evelyn tried to speak, her lips parting, but the words broke like dry twigs, and only the sound of the wind carried her struggle. He didn't push. He only nodded once, the way ranchers do when they know a storm will tell its own story in time. The prairie stretched out before them, wide and wild, and for the first time she felt the land was big enough to swallow her sorrow without judgment. Her breath steadied, and though the ache in her chest stayed, it was no longer a cage. It was a door that might someday open. Alejandro finally spoke, his voice as steady as a river stone. "Out here, things got a way of finding their place. Reckon you will too." She turned her head, tears catching light, and for once she didn't feel ashamed of them falling. They felt like rain on thirsty soil. The air smelled of mesquite and dust, carrying with it the promise that today would not be the same as yesterday. Alejandro took a slow sip from his own cup, letting the silence breathe because he knew healing rode in on patience, not questions. Evelyn watched him, noticing the lines on his face carved deep by sun and storms, lines that spoke of battles fought with sweat, not wealth. Her heart recognized something honest there, something her old world had never offered, and she felt a strange warmth take root in her chest. The ranch creaked, the boards shifting under the weight of memory and time, and she realized this place was alive in a way her mansion never had been. She whispered barely above the wind, "I don't know where I belong anymore," and the words tasted like confession and surrender. Alejandro looked at her, eyes steady, and said, "Then maybe you're right where you're meant to be." By midday, the heat rose heavy, wrapping the land in a haze, and Evelyn followed Alejandro out to the barn with steps uncertain but determined. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and the sweat of long labor, and every corner seemed to breathe with stories older than she could imagine. Alejandro handed her a pitchfork, his grin small but genuine, saying, "Ain't no better way to settle the mind than keeping your hands busy." She hesitated, the tool foreign in her grip, but something inside her sparked at the chance to do work that mattered to no one but herself. Her father's world had been contracts and ledgers, masks and mirrors, and here she was facing a pile of hay with more truth than any deal ever held. Each lift of the fork sent dust spinning through shafts of sunlight, golden flecks dancing like hope scattered in the air. Alejandro worked beside her, strong and steady, never rushing, teaching her by example rather than lecture, letting her find her rhythm. Her muscles burned, her breath grew heavy, but the pain was different. It felt alive, earned, not forced or stolen by someone else's demand. When she faltered, he steadied the load with one hand, a simple touch that carried the weight of respect, not pity, and that difference mattered. Outside the cattle load, their calls rising and falling like a hymn sung in the language of the land itself. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, sweat dripping, and realized she hadn't thought of her father's threats for nearly an hour. The barn walls echoed with the sound of their labor, a symphony of effort that built not only strength but trust. Alejandro caught her eye once, tipped his hat again and said, "You're holding your own just fine, Miss Evelyn." The words rolled through her like thunder across open plains, deep and unshakable, carrying a respect she had never tasted before. She laughed, the sound surprising even herself, and it echoed in the barn rafters like a bird set free after a long winter. Alejandro smiled, and in that moment the air between them softened. Not romantic yet, but human, genuine, real. The horses stamped in their stalls, the dust swirled, and Evelyn felt the smallest seed of belonging push through her fear. The work left her weary but grounded, and for once exhaustion was a gift, not a punishment. As the barn doors creaked shut behind them, she felt the world inside her shift just slightly, towards something she had long forgotten. Peace. And Alejandro, walking beside her, thought quietly that maybe this runaway heiress had brought more to his ranch than she realized. Later that evening, the sun melted into the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold, the kind of sky that makes even the hardest days worth living. Evelyn sat on the porch again, her body sore, her spirit lighter, watching shadows stretch like long fingers across the land. Alejandro brought out a plate of beans and cornbread, setting it down as casual as a man tossing a rope across a fence. She tasted it slowly, the simple food richer than any banquet she had ever known, flavored with honesty and hunger. The night air cooled, carrying the faint smell of sage and the sound of coyotes calling their mournful song from far ridges. Evelyn leaned back, feeling for the first time that silence could be a friend, not an enemy, wrapping her like a worn quilt. Alejandro whittled a piece of wood, shavings falling like soft snow, his knife moving with the rhythm of someone who'd made peace with patience. The crackle of the fire pit stitched the moment together, each spark a small reminder that warmth could be found even after dark roads. She asked him softly, "Why did you help me?" her voice carrying the weight of someone unused to kindness without strings. He paused, knife still, and said, "Out here folks either look out for each other or they don't last long. Reckon I just ain't one for watching someone sink." Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from gratitude, a feeling that felt foreign and fragile all at once. Alejandro's words lingered, the kind that burrow deep and build roots where hope once thought it couldn't grow. The stars began to crowd the sky, one by one, as if heaven itself had come to listen in on their quiet exchange. Evelyn lifted her gaze and whispered almost to herself, "It feels different here, like I can breathe without pretending." Alejandro nodded, eyes on the horizon, and said, "That's the land talking, and it don't lie." Her heart stirred at the thought, wondering if maybe the land knew her better than the marble halls she had fled. The fire snapped, the coyotes howled, and the ranch seemed to stand as a shield against all the shadows chasing her. Alejandro glanced at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes, and though he said nothing more, the silence felt safe. In that stillness, Evelyn realized that safety wasn't in walls or riches. It was in people who chose to stand firm when the wind blew hard. And for the first time in years, she felt she might not be running anymore, but beginning. But peace out on the frontier never sits long without shadows, and Evelyn felt the weight of her past trailing like a dust cloud on the horizon. She had grown up in mansions where marble staircases echoed with secrets, where her father's voice cracked like a whip dressed in silk. Charles Marlowe didn't raise daughters, he raised heirs, and when Evelyn chose her own will, he called it rebellion fit for punishment. The arranged marriage he planned for her was less about love and more about land, business, and power stacked higher than a mountain of silver. She had fled in the night, trading velvet gowns for worn boots, carriages for lonesome miles under a hard prairie moon. Every creek she crossed whispered with danger, every innkeeper's stare weighed her down, and every rustle in the brush made her heart bolt like a startled colt. She never told Alejandro all of it, only broken pieces, words that slipped out like stray sparks when the fire cracked. But Alejandro was a man who didn't need full stories to read truth. He knew pain when he saw it carved deep in someone's eyes. One night she confessed, "My father will send men after me," and the words shivered through the air like the first strike of a rattlesnake. Alejandro didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't look away. He only said, "Then he'll have to find his way through Texas dust first." The rancher's calm steadied her, though she knew the hunt would come and fear coiled inside her chest like barbed wire. Days passed, filled with chores, mending fences, feeding stock, and every nail she hammered became a prayer against her past. She found strength in work, in calluses forming on her hands, proof that she could belong to something beyond her father's name. But at night, dreams carried her back to those marble halls, voices echoing threats and footsteps chasing her down endless corridors. She woke more than once with tears staining the quilt, and each time Alejandro sat silent in the kitchen, coffee brewing, waiting for her breath to settle. He never pressed her, never demanded details, only let her know by presence that the night couldn't steal her tomorrow. The land itself seemed to side with her, giving her mornings of crimson skies, evenings of quiet stars, and nights where coyotes cried for someone else. Still, Evelyn carried a weight heavier than any saddle, the kind you can't drop on the trail, the kind that rides with you until you face it. Alejandro sensed it. New storms don't vanish on their own, and he braced himself for the day when her past would ride up the ridge. For now, though, he let her breathe in the simple mercy of ranch life, one sunrise at a time. The days rolled like wagon wheels, steady but wearing grooves, and the ranch slowly wove Evelyn into its rhythm. She learned to fetch water from the well, her arms shaking at first but later steady, the rope biting her palms like honest labor. Alejandro showed her how to saddle a horse, his hands sure, his voice calm, every step a lesson in patience and grit. Her first ride was awkward, the animal sensing her nerves, but Alejandro rode alongside, his presence strong enough to calm even the wind. The trail stretched wide, mesquite trees marking the path, and Evelyn felt the thrill of freedom in every hoofbeat beneath her. The air smelled of sage, the sun burned her cheeks, and for once she laughed without shame, the sound carried away by prairie breeze. Alejandro watched from the corner of his eye, not with judgment but with quiet pride, the kind a man feels when someone rediscovers their own fire. At night, they returned sore and dusty, clothes streaked, hands blistered, but Evelyn felt richer than she ever had in jeweled halls. Alejandro cooked beans in an iron pot, the smoke rising into a sky crowded with stars that looked close enough to rope. They ate in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace, the kind that doesn't need filling with chatter. Evelyn leaned against the porch rail, watching embers fade, her heart tugging at the question of whether this could be her true life. She whispered once, "I don't deserve this peace," and Alejandro answered without pause, "Peace ain't something earned, it's something you let yourself take." The words settled in her chest like seed in tilled earth, and she wondered if they might bloom into courage. But courage had its test waiting, and even as she breathed in the night, she sensed the trail of riders somewhere behind her. Alejandro sharpened his knife by lantern light, steel singing against stone, not for threat but for readiness. The cattle shifted restless in the pens, hooves stamping, and the night seemed to listen harder than before. Evelyn pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, knowing safety is fragile when your past still wears spurs. She glanced at Alejandro, his face carved by shadows and flame, and trusted him more than she trusted the ground beneath her. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, the sound cutting sharp, and Evelyn shivered though the fire still burned hot. She closed her eyes, hoping dawn would bring more than just light. It would bring strength enough to face what chased her. It was on the 6th day that the image came alive, the one etched forever in memory, the true turning point of her flight. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in streaks of fire, and Evelyn stood in the yard, dust clinging to her dress, breath ragged. Her figure trembled, silhouetted against the ranch house glowing warm, while Alejandro stepped down from the porch, lantern in hand. The air was thick, every sound sharpened. The restless snort of horses, the creak of wood, the distant beat of hooves not yet seen. She clutched her shawl to her chest, eyes wide, as if the whole weight of her past was about to crash into this fragile refuge. Alejandro stopped in front of her, boots planted firm in the dust, his presence unshaken, a wall against the coming storm. The lantern cast his face in golden shadow, the lines of hardship now shining as strength, and his voice cut through the fear. "You're safe here now," he repeated, not as comfort but as a declaration, a promise stronger than any oath inked on paper. The ranch glowed behind them, a fortress of wood and will, and Evelyn felt the tremors in her body answer to the steadiness of his stance. In that moment, the runaway heiress and the weathered rancher stood like two souls at the crossroads, the past snarling at their backs. The cattle stirred louder, sensing the weight of destiny thickening in the dusk, their calls echoing through the corral like warning drums. Evelyn's breath caught, but Alejandro laid a hand on her shoulder, steady, grounding, telling her the land itself would shield her. The horizon burned crimson, the wind whipped her hair wild, and the ranch felt alive, pulsing with every heartbeat of protection. She closed her eyes, hearing his words again, and the fear that once crushed her began to loosen its grip like frost under morning sun. This was the image burned into the story, the still frame where everything pivoted from running to standing. It was not the end, but the midpoint, the line in the dirt where past and future clashed in silence. The night would test them yet, but Evelyn knew with a certainty that shocked her that she was no longer alone in the fight. Alejandro's eyes, steady as the North Star, met hers, and she realized safety wasn't a place. It was a person who stood their ground. The wind roared across the prairie, carrying their vow into the wide sky, sealing the moment as destiny's turning. And from that breath forward, the story was no longer about escape. It was about rebirth. The days that followed felt different, like the ranch itself had shifted after that vow beneath the crimson sky. Evelyn walked with her shoulders a little higher, not because fear had left her, but because courage had found a place to stand. Alejandro gave her no speeches, no sermons, just steady work and the kind of company that eases sorrow without naming it. They rode out at dawn, the dew wetting the grass, horses' hooves drumming the earth like a heartbeat older than both of them. Evelyn learned to hold the reins tighter, to trust the animal beneath her, and to feel the land as part of her own skin. Alejandro corrected her posture once, a hand gentle on her back, and the touch sparked more hope than shame. They fixed fence posts side by side, the hammer striking nails in rhythm, each blow a defiance against the ghosts still trailing her. The sky stretched wide above, so endless it seemed to swallow her fear whole, leaving only the sound of her own breath. At night, Evelyn found herself listening for the coyotes, but instead of fear, the sound felt like proof that life still sang in the dark. Alejandro sat by the fire, knife carving small shapes from wood, and each curl of shaving seemed like a story told without words. She caught herself smiling more, laughter sneaking past her lips like a secret finally free to escape. One evening she whispered, "Maybe I can belong here," her voice trembling but carrying a seed of faith. Alejandro didn't look up from his carving, just said, "Reckon the land don't take folks it don't want. Looks to me it's making room for you." Her chest ached with a sweetness she hadn't known before, a tenderness born from sweat, dust, and honest kindness. The heiress in her still felt strange, like a ghost walking beside the woman she was becoming, but she no longer hated the shadow. Every blister on her hands felt like proof she could be something other than her father's pawn. Every sunrise felt like permission to keep walking forward, no matter who might be following behind. The ranch grew louder with her presence, her laughter, her tears, her songs hummed softly while hanging clothes to dry. Alejandro noticed, though he never said much, But inside he knew the house had never felt so alive. And Evelyn, in the quiet of her own heart, began to believe she might have found more than shelter. She had found a reason to stop running. Still, the prairie has a way of reminding folks that peace is never free, and Evelyn felt the tremor of storm clouds far off. She saw it in the letters Alejandro received from town, whispers of strangers asking questions that smelled of money and threats. The store clerk mentioned men in suits riding through, their city boots too clean for the dust they walked on. Evelyn's stomach turned each time the subject came up, knowing her father's reach stretched farther than she wanted to believe. Alejandro read the signs, though he didn't tell her everything. He just worked harder, rode farther, watched the horizon with sharper eyes. She noticed the way he cleaned his rifle by lamplight, not out of habit, but out of readiness for what might come. At night, the coyotes sounded closer, their cries almost warnings, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. She told Alejandro once, her voice breaking, "They'll find me, they always do." And the despair in her tone cracked something inside him. He set the rifle down, looked her square in the eyes, and said, "Ain't a soul alive gonna drag you back if I can help it." The words hit her like thunder, not just promise but protection, and for the first time she let herself believe someone might fight for her. She pressed a hand to her chest, tears rising not from weakness but from the overwhelming gift of being defended. Alejandro reached out, not with passion but with steady respect, a touch on her hand that said he wasn't afraid of her brokenness. Evelyn held onto that hand longer than she expected, the warmth of it chasing the cold her father had planted long ago. The night passed heavy but alive, the fire crackling between them, two souls finding strength in silence. In the morning she rose early, surprising Alejandro by already feeding the chickens, her hair messy, her dress dusted, but her smile sure. He tipped his hat, hiding a grin, and said, "Reckon you're turning into ranch folk quicker than I thought." Her laugh rang across the yard, light and free, and it struck Alejandro that this runaway heiress was no longer running quite the same way. But he knew storms don't ask permission before they break, and the wind carried with it a warning that trials weren't done. Still, for now, he let her laughter fill the ranch, because laughter was armor too, even if she didn't know it. And Evelyn, holding on to the sound of her own joy, felt ready to stand taller when the past finally rode in. The 9th day brought a heat that shimmered across the land, waves of fire rolling off the dirt like the world itself was sweating. Evelyn tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her hands rougher now, and went to work beside Alejandro with determination etched on her face. They herded cattle down the slope, dust kicking up in great clouds, horns glinting under the merciless sun. Alejandro rode steady, his hat pulled low, his voice carrying across the herd with commands sharp as whip cracks. Evelyn followed his lead, surprising even herself with how her voice rose, how the cattle turned at her call, how power rushed through her veins. Her horse responded too, quick under her guidance, and for a moment she felt like the prairie itself had accepted her as one of its own. Alejandro glanced at her, pride flickering in his eyes, and she met his look with a smile that burned brighter than the sun above them. The work was brutal, sweat-stinging eyes, muscles screaming, but Evelyn felt alive, the kind of alive that no ballroom ever offered. Her dress was torn at the hem, boots caked with mud, face streaked with dust, and she never looked more herself than in that moment. When the herd finally calmed, dust settling like smoke after battle, she sat tall in the saddle, chest heaving, heart triumphant. Alejandro rode up beside her, his horse snorting, and tipped his hat, a silent nod that meant more than 100 spoken praises. She laughed, not delicate but loud, real, free, echoing across the plains like a banner raised in victory. The sound startled birds from the mesquite trees, wings beating skyward, a celebration written by nature itself. Alejandro said, "Didn't reckon I'd see the day you looked more cowhand than heiress." She shot back, grinning through her exhaustion. "Maybe that heiress is long gone." The words tasted good, like truth finally spoken, and Alejandro felt them settle deep in the soil of his heart. But as the sun sank lower, shadows stretched long, and Evelyn's smile faltered just slightly, remembering the hunt not far behind. She whispered to herself, "Not yet, not safe yet." And Alejandro, though he didn't hear, seemed to sense the tremor anyway. The prairie, wide and watchful, carried the weight of both her triumph and her dread, holding them in balance for what was to come. And as the stars prepared to claim the sky, the land seemed to murmur that the real test had only just begun. The 10th day dawned red, a sky painted with warning, and Alejandro knew weather wasn't the only storm riding in. Evelyn woke before sunrise, drawn by restlessness, her heart thumping with the weight of dreams she couldn't shake. She walked the fence line, boots crunching dry earth, the chill biting her skin, but inside her chest the heat of dread burned hotter. The cattle stirred uneasily, as if they too sensed riders somewhere beyond the ridge, shadows stretching long toward the ranch. Alejandro joined her, his hat pulled low, rifle slung across his back, calm but sharp-eyed as a hawk circling prey. He didn't say much, only tipped his head toward the horizon, where the sky bled into the land like an old scar reopened. Evelyn swallowed hard, whispering, "They're coming, aren't they?" Though it sounded more like she already knew the answer. Alejandro kept his gaze steady, replying, "Reckon trouble's been sniffing round, but trouble don't scare me none." His words should have comforted her, but fear still coiled inside her like a rattlesnake ready to strike. She pressed her hand to the wood of the fence, as if the land itself could lend her courage, and felt its solid grain steady her. Alejandro touched her shoulder, firm but gentle, his hand saying more than words that she wouldn't face this alone. The morning stretched quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes horses flick their ears and dogs growl low in their throats. Evelyn wanted to believe safety could last, but deep down she knew safety isn't given. It's fought for, claimed, protected. Her eyes filled, not with weakness, but with the ache of a woman realizing she might have to stand and fight too. Alejandro saw it, nodded once and said, "Don't matter where you come from, out here it's what you stand for that counts." The words burned into her like fire branding leather, carving strength where fear had lived too long. She drew a breath, long and heavy, the prairie wind filling her lungs with grit and resolve. The heiress inside her trembled, but the woman she was becoming clenched her fists and stood taller. The sun rose higher, burning away shadows, and Evelyn knew the day of reckoning was closer than ever. And beside her, Alejandro's presence felt like the ground itself, unshakable, solid, eternal. By afternoon, the ranch hummed with tension. Even the birds seemed to hush, wings cutting sharp lines across the pale sky. Evelyn tried to steady herself with chores, hauling water, feeding stock, anything to drown the pounding in her chest. Alejandro moved through the yard like a man half listening to the earth, every sound testing his patience, every silence pressing on him. The wind carried dust, swirling in small devils, and Evelyn couldn't help but think of riders cloaked in that storm. She paused at the corral, watching a horse toss its head, snorting like it could smell strangers on the air. Alejandro joined her, leaning on the rail, his expression calm, but his jaw tight with the weight of unspoken thought. He finally said, "When trouble shows, you don't run. You face it, like the land faces every storm thrown at it." Evelyn shivered, not from cold, but from the thought of standing her ground when every instinct screamed to flee. She confessed, "I've never fought for myself, not once," the words spilling heavy like chains sliding off old wrists. Alejandro's gaze softened, voice low. "Ain't never too late to learn, and reckon you ain't alone in it now." Her throat closed, tears rising because she realized he wasn't just speaking kindness, he was staking himself on her survival. For a moment, silence settled between them, not empty but thick with unspoken promises and steady faith. The sky darkened as clouds rolled in, thunder grumbling far away, and Evelyn felt the land itself preparing. She wiped her face, set her jaw, and muttered, "Then I'll learn," surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Alejandro smiled, small but proud, the kind of smile a man wears when he sees the first spark catch flame. The storm broke across the plains, rain lashing fences, mud sucking boots, and Evelyn worked through it side by side with him. Every drop soaked her, every gust stung her, but she pushed harder, proving to herself that fear didn't own her anymore. Alejandro watched, respect carving deeper into his heart, because this was no longer a runaway heiress, this was a fighter. The storm passed, leaving the land shining under twilight, and Evelyn stood soaked, trembling but unbroken. Alejandro tipped his hat, saying nothing, but the pride in his eyes told her she had already changed. Night settled heavy, stars crowding the sky, their cold light spilling like salt across the dark canvas above. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, boots muddy, hair dripping from the storm, her chest alive with exhaustion and victory. Alejandro sat beside her, rolling a cigarette, hands steady, the flick of flint sparking tiny suns before the flame caught. The smoke curled upward, thin and ghost-like, carrying with it the weight of thoughts neither dared put to words. She broke the silence first, whispering, "I don't know who I am anymore," the confession slicing the night wide open. Alejandro exhaled slow, eyes on the horizon, and replied, "Reckon you're someone stronger than you ever thought." Her heart bucked against her ribs, not from fear but from the startling truth of his words, truth she couldn't deny anymore. The night carried coyote calls, lonesome but less threatening now, almost like the land was singing a hymn just for them. She leaned her head back, staring at the stars, realizing for the first time that the sky wasn't empty. It was a roof too vast to cage her. Her tears fell quiet, not out of despair but release, like rivers long dammed finally running free into open country. Alejandro let her cry without interruption, knowing tears sometimes water the soil where courage grows. She wiped her cheeks, laughing once at herself, surprised that joy could sneak into sorrow's shadow. He looked at her then, eyes lit by starlight, and said, "Don't reckon you see it yet, but you've already started belonging here." Her breath hitched, because belonging was a word she thought had died in her long ago. The night wrapped them in silence again, but it was the kind that warmed, not chilled, like a quilt stitched by time. Alejandro's presence beside her was solid, unshaken, the kind of company that could carry someone through hell and back. She whispered softly, "Thank you," though she knew words were too small for what she felt. Alejandro tipped his hat, not as politeness but as acknowledgement, as if her gratitude was shared and understood. The prairie wind stirred, cool and alive, carrying their quiet into the wide world like a promise meant to last. And Evelyn, for the first time in her life, believed she wasn't running anymore, she was arriving. Morning light spilled over the hills, golden and sharp, painting the ranch in a glow that felt both holy and fragile. Evelyn woke early, her body sore but alive, her spirit steadier than the day before, as if each sunrise carved more steel into her bones. Alejandro was already outside, saddling horses, his movements sure and unhurried, like a man who knew time could be trusted. She joined him, tying her hair back, boots crunching on gravel, ready to ride not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. They headed out to mend the north fence, the trail lined with mesquite and cactus, the kind of path that tests a rider's grit. Evelyn kept pace, learning to hold herself upright, each bump in the trail less frightening, more freeing. Alejandro glanced back once, his eyes crinkling in approval, though he said nothing, letting her earn the silence. At the fence line, they worked side by side, stretching wire, pounding posts, sweat dripping, hands aching but steady. Her palms blistered raw, but she welcomed the sting, proof that her life was no longer made of porcelain and false smiles. The prairie wind blew through her hair, wild and unrestrained, and for once she didn't try to tame it. She let it claim her. Alejandro told her stories of the land, of floods and droughts, of cattle drives that lasted weeks, of storms survived by stubborn faith. She listened like a child hearing gospel, her heart soaking in every word, because this world felt truer than any she had ever known. By noon they sat under a lone oak, sharing jerky and water, the silence between them thick with respect and something unspoken. Evelyn looked at her hands, calloused and red, and whispered, "I'm not the same woman I was when I arrived?" Alejandro chewed slow, nodded once and said, "Reckon that's the point of journeys worth taking." His words struck deep, and she realized she wasn't just escaping. She was transforming into someone she didn't yet fully recognize. The heiress she had been was fading, but not dying. She was becoming something new, forged from dust, sweat, and resilience. The fence stood strong now, wires tight, posts rooted deep, a mirror of the strength rising inside her. As they rode back, the ranch on the horizon felt less like refuge and more like destiny. And Evelyn knew without doubt that the land had begun to write her into its story. But destiny, like the land, has its trials, and Evelyn felt the weight of coming reckoning in the air that night. Alejandro sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, his movements calm but purposeful, every click echoing louder than words. She watched him, fear stirring, but also admiration, because his readiness wasn't born of violence, but of duty. The ranch dogs barked at shadows, restless, and the horses paced in their stalls, ears flicking, nostrils wide. Evelyn stood on the porch, quilt wrapped around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. In her chest, fear warred with courage, each heartbeat a drumbeat for a battle not yet begun. She whispered to herself, "I'm not running anymore," as if the night itself needed to hear her vow. Alejandro heard her, though she didn't know it, and his lips curled into the faintest smile of pride. He set the rifle down, stepped onto the porch, and stood beside her, their silence stronger than any prayer. The stars glowed fierce above, cold and eternal, bearing witness to two souls preparing to face whatever came. Evelyn turned to him, eyes glassy, and said, "If they find me, I'll stand, I won't hide." Alejandro nodded, his voice low. "That's all the land asks of anyone, to stand." Her chest tightened, not with fear but with determination, a fire rising where once there had been only trembling. The night stretched long, each sound sharper, each silence deeper, until even the owls seemed to hush. She prayed quietly, not with words but with breath, asking the land, the stars, the night itself for strength. Alejandro rested his hand lightly on the railing, steady, patient, as if his very presence was enough to hold her upright. The dogs finally settled, the horses stilled, and Evelyn felt the storm circling but not yet breaking. She realized she no longer feared the moment of reckoning. She awaited it, ready to prove herself. The prairie whispered in the wind, carrying with it the scent of rain and gunpowder yet to come. And together on that porch they stood as more than strangers. They stood as allies forged by fate. The following dawn broke pale, the sky streaked with gray, the kind of morning that feels like the world holding its breath. Evelyn rose early, her body tired but her spirit sharpened, every nerve alive with anticipation. Alejandro was already saddled, his gear strapped, his eyes scanning the ridge like a man reading the land's secret language. He handed her a small revolver, its weight surprising, its handle worn smooth by years of use. She hesitated, but he said, "Ain't about taking life, it's about keeping yours. Don't let no one take what's yours to keep." Her hand tightened around the grip, trembling but resolute, and she felt a strange power awaken in her chest. The ranch lay quiet, cattle grazing, dogs stretched in the dirt, but beneath the stillness pulsed a tension sharp as a drawn bowstring. Alejandro rode with her to the north pasture, the trail lined with mesquite shadows, the air heavy with silence. They dismounted by the creek, the water running slow, the land too quiet. Birds gone, the world waiting. Evelyn's breath came hard, every sound magnified, every step a drumbeat in her ears. Alejandro scanned the horizon, hand on his rifle, his posture unyielding, his presence anchoring her against fear. She remembered his words, about standing, about the land's demand for courage, and repeated them like prayer. Her pulse slowed, her spine straightened, and she realized the heiress who had arrived shaking was gone. In her place stood a woman tempered by fire, dust, and storms, ready to meet the world with eyes unflinching. The creek gurgled, the horses stamped, the wind shifted, and Evelyn felt destiny riding closer with each heartbeat. Alejandro turned to her, voice low but sure. "Storm's comin'. Don't forget. You ain't alone." She nodded, eyes fierce, hands steady, and for the first time she believed it fully. The prairie stretched endless before them, not as a cage but as an open book waiting for their mark. And as the sun climbed higher, she knew the reckoning was near, but she would no longer face it as prey. She would face it as someone reborn by the land, carrying courage like a weapon sharper than steel. The prairie night settled over them, vast and eternal. And Evelyn realized her journey was never about escape, but about awakening strength she never knew she carried. Alejandro's words echoed in her chest, not just promises, but truths hammered into her soul like iron nails driven into solid oak. She understood now that safety was not hidden in riches or walls, but in the courage to stand firm when storms tried to tear you down. The land had tested her, broken her, and rebuilt her, carving into her the kind of resilience only dust, sweat, and fire could teach. No longer the trembling heiress who arrived at the ranch in tears, she had become a woman rooted like mesquite in hard soil. Alejandro's steady presence had shown her that sometimes salvation isn't a miracle. It's the simple grace of someone refusing to leave your side. The wide sky above, filled with stars that had watched generations rise and fall, seemed to bow in quiet blessing over their newfound strength. Evelyn whispered a prayer, not for deliverance, but for purpose, knowing that the land had already claimed her as one of its own. And as she stood on that porch, lantern light glowing behind her, she vowed never again to run from who she was becoming. If this story reached into your heart, ride with us on this trail. Subscribe for more tales that inspire, share this with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments where you're joining us from, because stories, like sunsets, are better when shared beneath the same sky.